go ahead and start looking at this timeline and see if you can fill anything in, if you haven't already. And Jordan's going to let us know when we can go live here. And did everyone get handouts? Handouts? Oh, I am live. All right. I got more. All right. Well, if you can't already tell, we're studying the book of Daniel. Did anybody, was that anybody surprised reading through Monday night on Zoom, how quick you could get through it? I wasn't able to attend that one, but kind of interesting. There's a lot that goes on in Daniel, right? I don't know. Daniel and I are teaching this on Wednesday nights for the third quarter, whatever this is now. I don't know if we'll use this again, but as I was going through it, I just kind of took down notes of words of things that are unusual or unique or specific to the story of Daniel, and a lot happens. There's a lot of players. There's a lot of characters both on the Jewish side and then the global kingdom side, and we go through a lot of kingdoms, a lot of dynasties really fast. I mean, you think about the rise and fall of Assyria, Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, and onto the Persian empires, the Syrian empire, and you think, oh, that must have been thousands of years. Well, there are bookends that touch all of those things within a 70-year period, which also happened to be our 70-year period of captivity. So there's a lot going on. What comes to your mind when you think of the story of Daniel? The book of Daniel. Lions, yeah. I think I got that up there. The furnace, yeah. It's impossible to understand. Jeremy, would you give me that other clicker that I plugged in? I'll see if it works. It's supposed to work that if I point it this way, it'll point that way, but we'll see if it works out tonight.
You have the statue, the vision.
The statue, the visions, yeah.
Actually, two visions.
Thank you. Two visions, at least two visions, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
It just said two dreams that were.
Yeah. Dreams and visions. Yeah, Mike.
Like for me, it's more of a generic thing. I mean, we have so many characters throughout the Bible that I feel like all say, and I feel like one of the things that I've always taken away from Daniel is make the right decision. There's really a major story.
Yeah.
Reprimanded by God.
It's interesting. Being only 12 chapters, we'll move through his life very quickly, which isn't that unusual. Lots of time passes in his life throughout the book. He's very young, and then at the end, if you follow any variation of the timelines, he's very old at the end of the book. And I don't know if that is not what the Lord wanted to call out his, but he gets a name like David. Does anybody remember? David was a man after God's own heart. Does anyone remember Daniel's name? The angel calls him something very specific. A man well loved, or a man greatly loved. So maybe to your point, Mike, he's a David figure, and we don't have as much written about him as David, but certainly. Was some of the things that stood out to me in the last week was that he is somebody that we don't get the dirty side of, if there was one. Anything else? One thing that we'll hammer on, I'm sure, is, especially with Nebuchadnezzar and his son, is Nebuchadnezzar has this great, there's a fall in the story, and then he comes to this great realization, and then in the next story, he's right back to his pride and ego, and then he comes to this great realization about God, and then the next chapter starts off, he's back in his anger and his pride, and it's this cycle, right? It's this thing, and it's almost like he has to be whacked on the back of the head several times to start to get it. And isn't that the story of our own lives, and whether that's the judges at a macro level or us as an individual level? I think those are the things that also kind of come to mind here. All right, with that, we have a lot of material to get through. Daniel and I discussed that we've done the history lesson with Esther, we just did Ezekiel, maybe a few other times before then, but I can't help myself. I don't think I got time as a young person to stitch all this together, and I love putting this story together and trying to, Esther and Ezra and Jeremiah and Daniel and Isaiah, where do they all fall? And so we'll spend a little bit of time here tonight doing that, and then we'll get into the book next week. All right, here's our class schedule. We'll put this PowerPoint online if you want to refer to it. Maybe it'd be a good thing to print out for you to have. I don't know if anyone's aware, but there are 2 pregnant women that are married to both one to Daniel and one to me. So we've tried to work around that, but we may have some pinch hitting going on back and forth throughout this quarter. That's right. Alex is on the ready. Okay, so let's dig in. I want to go back before we do this. Let's look at 2 Kings 23 and 24. If you have that available, go ahead and turn it. We're not going to read 23, but does anybody just happen to be a savant on 2 Kings and knows what chapter 23 is about? Josiah, good call. And Josiah, we have this great passage here, and what has already happened? Israel has already fallen, and most of the kings are bad, and all of a sudden we get this young man, Josiah, and he comes to the throne, and what happens? Reform, purity, a man after his father David. Look in verses 15. He starts pulling down the altars in earlier verses, but even the altar and high places he demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Verse 20, Josiah slaughtered all the priests of the high places and the altars, and burned human bones on the altars, and burned human bones on them. 21, he commanded the people to celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God. Furthermore, in verse 24, Josiah got rid of the mediums and the spiritists. And we come to 26, and let's pause for a second. What are we feeling about Judah with Josiah in charge here? David? Maybe some glimpses of hope and good things with the people and God. But we get to 26 and 27, and we read the following. Nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah, because all that Manasseh had done it to arouse his anger. So the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my presence, as I removed Israel, and I will reject Jerusalem, the city I chose, and this temple about which I said, my name shall be there. So even with all this that Josiah did, this bright moment in the history, it's not enough to turn God away from his wrath. And this is, part of the prophecy, right? What is the cause that is quoted here in these verses? The sin of Manasseh. And you can see that several times throughout this chapter here. And we come down to Jehoahaz the king. And what does Jehoahaz do? Daniel talked about this at the beginning of Ezekiel. Does anyone remember Jehoahaz's contribution to the nation of Judah? He basically started taxing the Jews to pay the Egyptians, right? He did evil. We don't have another good king here at the end. So he basically put himself under the rule of the Egyptians. And we see the Pharaoh's take over here at the end. Jehoahaz. Yeah, in verse 31 and 32 of 2 Kings 23, you can see verse 32, Jehoahaz did evil in the eyes of the Lord as his predecessors has done. Pharaoh Necho put him in chains at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he imposed Judah a levy of 100 talents of gold. And this is just a pattern that kind of begins of this vassal type king, right? And Pharaoh puts in his son, Jehoiakim. I don't know why I chose 3 on the handout, but the last 3 start with Jehoiakim. And we see that here at the end of chapter 23. He did evil, just as his predecessors has done. And that brings us to chapter 24. I do want to read this chapter just because who comes on the scene in 24 verse 1? Nebuchadnezzar, key player in our Daniel lesson here. So let's read chapter 24 real quickly. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he turned against Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled. The Lord sent Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against him to destroy Judah, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants, the prophets. Surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood, for he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. As for the other events in Jehoiakim's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim rested with his ancestors, and Jehoiachin his son succeeded him as king. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country again, because the king of Babylon had taken all of his territory from Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan. She was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin's prisoner, and as the Lord declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace, and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men, and the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. He also took Jerusalem to Babylon, the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also departed to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans. He made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in place in charge of and changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Hamudal, daughter of Jeremiah. She was from Libnah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. It's because of the Lord's anger that all this had happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end thrust them from his presence. Now, Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So there's definitely a pattern here, right? I don't know how you tell the story of Daniel without 2 Kings 24 here. It really just, and this is what's so cool about this period of time, is there's so much secular history and there's so much biblical specificity on the years that these things happened. And when you start layering all these things on top of each other, you can find a lot of really cool evidence for the validity of these events. So the last three kings in Judah. Anybody take notes? Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And we've already seen Assyria take over Israel, Egypt enforce taxes on and take kings over Judah, and Babylon now take captive all of the people of Judah. So what is the state of the Jewish citizenship and their leadership during the time period of Daniel? We could call it one word, exile, but more specifically, there were vassal kings. They were taxed and had to pay, allegiance to other people, even in the beginning, and then so many of them were removed, right? All right, this one isn't necessarily in the text here, but what are three other prominent Jewish stories that we know of during this time? You can't use Ezekiel. There's a lot of answers here, for sure.
One's clearly Daniel.
Yeah. Daniel is notable at the time of captivity, for sure. Jeremiah, and he gave us the prophecy of what? 70 years or hope for the people, right? Yeah. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther. All this happened in a very short amount of time. Let's go to, since we're talking about some of these folks, let's go to these texts here and read them real quickly. Ezekiel 36:22. We want to read the whole thing here. Okay, so here we are with the Jewish nation. They've fallen. They've been taken captive. Maybe the temple hasn't been destroyed yet, but we know that's in God's wishes to do from 2 Kings. Let's read Ezekiel 22 through 31 real quick. Therefore, say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord of God, I do not do this for your sake, O house of Israel, but for my holy name's sake, which we talked about a lot during the last quarter, right? This is about God's glory and his name, which they profaned among nations wherever they went. And I will sanctify my great name, which you have profaned in their midst, and nations shall know that I am the Lord, says the Lord of God, when I am hallowed before you, before their eyes. For I will take you from among the nations, gather you out of all countries, and bring you into your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will keep my judgments and do them. Then you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. I will deliver you from your uncleanness, and I will call for the grain and multiply it, and bring no famine upon you. And I will multiply the fruit of your trees and increase of your fields, so that you need never again bear the reproach of famine among nations. Then you will remember your evil ways and your deeds that were not good, and you will loathe yourselves in your own sight for your iniquities and your abominations. What's prophesied here? Well, two things that'll happen. Y'all are going to make Daniel feel self-conscious here. They're going to get a new heart. So the people are going to be renewed. They're going to be made clean, and they'll go to their land. Maybe there's three things if you want to count it that way. God's name will be glorified, right? God's name will be exalted here. So that's a prophecy of what's going to happen after the exile. We already mentioned Jeremiah, who gave us the hope. Daniel mentions the 70 years. I think for time's sake, let's just look at Jeremiah 25:12 real quick. There's a couple places this is quoted, but Jeremiah 25:12. Then it will come to pass, when 70 years are completed, that I will punish the king of Babylon and the nation and the land of the Chaldeans for their iniquity, says the Lord, and I will make it a perpetual desolation. And then you see in the 29:10 verse that's actually when the 70 years of captivity will be completed and they'll be able to return. I put 2 Chronicles 36 on here. It's not a prophecy. It just is when the captivity and the fall actually happens, the destruction there. I'm not sure what I was thinking about that in terms of prophecy, but we did see that prophecy in 2 Kings 24, and then it come to pass here in 2 Kings 36. Any thoughts about these prophecies? A couple of things I would pick out. One is very specific, right? It's not after 7 times in the time, like we're going to get into all that, but not here, right? This is very specific. It's very literal, and the timeline is just so cool here. But the second thing I would point out is, maybe God's love and restitution here. We saw a lot of God's wrath at the end of 24, despite people doing some seemingly pretty good things. And we see God's love and embrace of the people. And you have to get into this to understand if okay, maybe you're not Daniel. Maybe you were sitting next to Daniel on the caravan up there, right? How do you feel, right? What do you need to know to be faithful, to be hopeful? What are you looking for? Where have you been? What were your parents doing at this time? Were they killed in some of these? Are you with your family? Have you been separated? And what hope do you have, right? I think all of this is really important to kind of get into the mind of the people that we're about to study about, particularly the Jews that we're about to study about. But yeah, Daniel.
I actually never thought of this until you were saying it that way. You mentioned earlier that Daniel lived to see the 70 years completed. And we know from Daniel 1 that it was many of the youth of the royal house that were taken at first by the Babylonians. So you wonder if these teenagers that knew about the 70-year prophecy, that struck them differently because they're thinking, hey, we're going to see this. It's not like 60, 70-year-old people thinking, oh, in 70 years when I'm long gone, God's going to pay back Babylon and bring us home. They're thinking, hey, in our lifetime, God has promised that we're going to see Babylon fall and home. You wonder if that maybe took more root in them as young people because they anticipated actually.
Yeah. And, that's evidence. There was people wailing at the temple when it was rebuilt, and it was small, and were they willing to be back, or because it wasn't the same glory? I don't know, but you see that there are people that return from exile that had seen the temple once before. So, yep.
Fly on the wall aspect. I know for me it's difficult as my upbringing, the nation part of being overthrown or being overtaken. It's a difficult thing for me. I don't want to speak for others, but it's probably a concept that we're not real comfortable about, or we get the hair on the back of our necks. It really is going to require us to get out of what we are.
Yeah. I mean, imagine Russia taking over the U.S. for 19 years, and then after that, China takes over for the next 60, and then after that, somebody else. Like, can you imagine empires going that quickly? And how disheveled everyone in the world would have felt? Like, this was a very tumultuous time in empirical history. I don't know if that's a fair way to say that, but nonetheless. Okay, and anything else about these prophecies? Could be a whole class on this, I'm sure. 13 weeks of prophecies, that would be pretty cool, actually. But all right, moving on. So let's talk about these foreign authorities real quick. We've already learned a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar. We know from history he comes on the scene about 605. There's a couple of ways to interpret this. Does anybody here want to be a history major? Me either. I'm not here to debate Jordan. I knew I was looking for him. I'm not here to debate on this, but we'll go with a workable timeline. If you have a different idea, I'm open to hearing it. But when does he come on the biblical scene? We just read this. The reign of Jehoiakim, right at the end of the reign of Judah, last couple of kings. And I kind of read this verse slowly. What happened 3 times in that last chapter to Nebuchadnezzar by the Jewish kings? No, they rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. They all. Do you think he's in love with the Jewish people right now? The Jewish nobles' children? No, probably not. He's probably pretty irritated, right? In fact, so irritated that he smacks them down and puts them in exile, right? So Nebuchadnezzar and the Jews are not starting off on the greatest foot where we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 1. We learn about his son, Belshazzar. Anybody remember who he was besides Nebuchadnezzar's son in the book? No, but Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son, and is it 5 or 6? He and there's probably a leader in between those two. He's actually not in secular history. The only record on him is in the book of Daniel here, which is pretty interesting. And he directly predicated the Persian Empire. So he was at the very end of the Babylonian reign here. And then Darius, again, could be up for debate. I'll probably say Darius, but did he have any relation? Yep, Jordan. Yeah, he definitely, whether he wrote it or Daniel recorded his own words, those are the words of, and that's an interesting thought. I wonder how many words like that are written by a non-Jew in the Old Testament, authored at some level. Yeah, that is interesting. Talk a little bit more about language here in a second. I think the point is Darius had no relationship to Nebuchadnezzar. This was, and we'll read about that again in the transition here, a new empire. And does anybody remember Ezra, what Darius did here? What did Ezra do? Ezra rebuilt the walls of Nehi. Nehemiah built the wall, so Ezra built the temple. I learned that as a third grader or something. Anyway, the wall wasn't that short. But Ezra rebuilt the temple. We see in Ezra chapter 6 here, actually, I think I was going to try to read this whole passage as well, but Darius in Ezra 6 verse 1 made a decree to look into archives, and he found where Cyrus had decreed to give all the money back to the Jews that had been taken from them, which is just a cool concept, because if a Babylonian took all the treasury, the vast vessels and all the things, and went through these empirical changes to the second Persian emperor, and they still knew that this bucket of things in the treasury were from the Jews. I mean, think of the record keeping, all the administrative work that was in all of that change, and maybe you can say that you could see God's providence in that. But this was a sophisticated empire. There's lots going on here, and Cyrus had said to do this, and the people, you'll remember, did not want to get to work on anything. They were really dragging their feet, so much so that another emperor came to power, Darius, and he had to go find the archives where this was authorized, and he said, let them do it. Let them get to work. Let them build the house, pay whatever they need to be paid out of the royal revenue. give them bulls and rams for offering. This emperor loved the people of Israel enough, was showing God. And we could get into some of their religious beliefs around Zoroaster, and every time they waged war, they felt they needed to go appease a god so they could keep things in balance. But nonetheless, this is the same, likely Darius the Mede was the same king that we find here in Ezra. And Ezra was a scribe. Ezra probably wrote 2nd Chronicles, or if not both Chronicles, as well as Ezra. And he lived through much of the same time with Daniel. It's even possible they knew each other. He might have been from the same group of young men that were exiled. So again, lots of books. We've talked about lots of different stories, and they all come together in Daniel, which I think is really cool. And Daniel really, his book is the 70 years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But do you know who the three kings are in the book now? Their powers, their nations. There was none. That was the point. The empire changed in that moment. So, all right. We can talk about this for a minute. This looks terrible on the screen here. I do want to stitch some of these thoughts together, if we can. How many years of captivity? 70. Okay, so I'm going to point to a couple of things if this works. Okay, so up here, this red dot, that's what we just read in 2 Kings 24, and we read that passage we listed that passage in 2 Chronicles. It is 70 years before Ezra before Nehemiah leads the people back, and that's the second red dot. It is cool if that would work, but that's the second. So there's 70 years between that and that. Is the temple destroyed when the people are exiled? Is the temple destroyed in that chapter in 2 Kings 24? No. It actually happens, nearly 5 years later, and this is that blue dot. So it happens in the siege 3 here. We find that temple is destroyed, and it's 69 and a half years later. We can be that specific. 69 and a half years later that the temple is rebuilt. Do you want to debate with me which one is the 70 years prophesied? I don't. It's kind of cool that they both, I count 69 and a half. I think that counts to me as 70. It's kind of cool that they're staggered and they're both 70 years. You can see this little box here, the Assyrian destruction, the fall of Israel, and the fall of Judah. What was destroyed here? The temple. Thank you. All right. Fall of Israel, fall of Judah, and the temple was destroyed. And this line here, if you look on your sheet, represents Daniel. And he leaves with the exile. And the last story is here, right as Darius takes power, which is when they get to rebuild the temple. So Daniel really, from the first siege where they're exiled to when the temple was decreed, we know he lived 3 years into Darius' reign. He lived this whole time. So this is at least 75 years, right? And when Daniel is a young man in the very first story, is he 4? Is he 8? He's arguing with the king's eunuch, right? So he had to have some knowledge and fortitude. Let's call him 14, 15, 18, I don't care. He's at least 90 years old at the end of the book. So it's not very likely Daniel lived on to see the temple built or return to Jerusalem at the end of the story, because it just, that really doesn't make a lot of sense. But what's so cool to me is just how well this story bookends everything that we see here, from the exile all the way to Darius calling for the money to be spent on the temple, that really being restarted. And he saw it all, right? Alongside of that, the remnant returns and the temple's rebuilt here. That's the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Like we see Jeremiah, this prophet of hope. Oh, thank you. We see Jeremiah and Isaiah. I don't know if the pointer is even helpful at this point, but if you're looking at your paper, Esther is here with Cyrus. Most likely that was the Xerxes mentioned in that story, and then Ezra coming to rebuild the temple. And then the bottom line is all the minor prophets down there. So if you were trying to fill it in, I don't know. Does that help you put any of these stories together? I had never done it till preparing this document. And like I said, you could probably prove that I'm off a few years somewhere, but pretty cool stitching all that together. A lot happens in 70 years. A lot of biblical, a lot of secular history happens in 70. Any thoughts or questions there? Yeah, Mike. Is it really? Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I'll even send it out in email. No? Christy's telling me no. I'll check with her, but no, we'll get that out to you. Anything else? Is it cool? Is it just me? It is kind of cool, right? Yeah. I'll even fill in the answers on the copy and email it out there. I'm moving fast because I want to tell you a lot. I'm sorry. That's right. That's right. Okay, 5 minutes left. Let's talk about the structure. The first half of the book is the story. We see a lot going on there. The lion's den, the fiery furnace, the first and second dreams of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel being a eunuch and eating vegetables. There's a lot of stories. And then the back half of the book is these visions of Daniel and kind of what they mean for him. Jordan kind of alluded to some of this, but the first chapter is written in Hebrew. Then you have chapters 2 through 7 are written in what language? Aramaic. And who are the visions received by in these stories? There's 3 of them. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. And they're interpreted by who? Daniel interprets those stories. That's right. Okay, I've given this away. But these stories all allude to the fact that God rules in the kingdoms of man. And Daniel's going to go a lot more into the structure here. There's a chiastic structure, which I'd never learned until the first time we taught this. It's such a cool concept. But God rules in the kingdoms of man, constantly reminded Nebuchadnezzar, just smack him on the back of the head. Gets harder and harder. And I think it kind of escalates too, right? At first it's Daniel's body. Then it's the actual kingdom itself. Then it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God has power over the fire and the physical matter of the people. It keeps escalating. Even over the king's psyche, maybe his soul, you could say. God has this, person on earth who is this deity of sorts, and just shows him over and over again how he rules in the kingdoms of man. And then the back half of the book, God is showing Daniel, oftentimes in very similar imagery, how he's going to preserve and save his sacred people. Which goes back to our point about being a youth, being a Jew in exile, right? If you had this prophecy from Jeremiah saying 70 years, and you're 42 years into it, what are you thinking? Maybe over halfway there. Are you still hopeful every day? Do you still have perseverance and faith and resolve? Now, if you could see the timeline, I guess some of you can read it. There's a lot of prophets writing, a lot of hope is being given, even reprimand is being given. But I think some of this is to help those faithful people that were with Daniel to see there is light at the end of the tunnel. Things will happen. It's not all good, though, is it? Right? So there are going to be trials. There are going to be struggles. Even after the 70 years period is over, you're going to have to persevere as a person and as a people. And that's a hard pill to swallow. How do you swallow that pill if you don't know the first 7 chapters? Don't worry, though. You're going to have to persevere. You're going to have to suffer. But I've smacked you in the back of the head to remind you, God rules in the kingdoms of man. I am in control of all these things. You remain faithful to me, and I will take care of you. And I think that's how you view this book as a whole. Any thoughts or questions there? Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I skipped over a few questions here. So obviously the second half, 8 through 12, not the half, but the back part of the book is written in Hebrew. All the visions are received by who? Daniel receives the visions, and they're interpreted. Well, he was the interpreter, so who interprets for him? Michael comes to back up the prince, the angel, the whoever he is. Michael goes to take care of his job so he can come and interpret these dreams for Daniel. Michael's definitely in there, but the angel comes and interprets for Daniel. Right. All right. Any other thoughts here? Sorry I went so fast. It's very interesting stuff, and I like putting this picture together, but happy to discuss any of it with you. I went so fast that I got through it. All right. Well, read chapter 1. Anything else for next Wednesday?
I'm realizing that I had a pre-class assignment.
Email it. Tell me. We'll work together. We'll give you this timeline with answers and the pre-class assignment for next Wednesday, maybe by tomorrow or Friday. All right. Thank you for your attention.